The contract sat on the mahogany desk like a weapon. Marilyn Monroe stared at it without blinking, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide the trembling. Across from her, three men in identical gray suits waited with the patient stillness of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. It was 1954, and she was the most photographed woman in America. Her face sold magazines, filled theaters, launched 1,000 fantasies. But in this office, the executive suite on the top floor of Paramount Studios, she was just a signature. They needed to own her for 7 more years. It's a generous offer, Marilyn. The voice belonged to Victor Hartwell, head of the studio, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. More money than any actress has ever been paid. Complete creative approval over your wardrobe, your own dressing room, everything you've asked for. He slid the contract closer to her, the pages crisp and heavy with legal language she'd spent 3 sleepless nights trying to decipher. Everything except the one thing that matters, Marilyn said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Hartwell leaned back in his leather chair, his expression still pleasant, still controlled. And what would that be? The right to say no, and the words hung in the air between them, delicate and dangerous. The 2 other men, lawyers, fixers, the ones who made problems disappear, exchanged glances that Marilyn had learned to read over the past 6 years. This wasn't going according to their script. Marilyn. Hartwell's voice took on a paternal tone, the one he used when he needed to remind her of her place. You're upset, emotional. Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting for when you've had time to— I've had 6 years, she interrupted, and something in her voice made all 3 men go still. 6 years of being told what to wear, how to speak, who to be seen with, what roles to accept. 6 years of being shaped and molded and packaged like a product on a shelf, and now you want 7 more. She stood, and the movement felt revolutionary. Stars didn't stand during contract negotiations. They sat, they smiled, they signed where they were told. I want script approval, Marilyn said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Real approval, not just wardrobe, but the actual role. I want the right to refuse projects that reduce me to decoration. I want to be an actress, not just a body the camera leers at. Hartwell's pleasant mask slipped, just for a moment. Marilyn, sweetheart, you need to understand something. The studio has invested millions in creating you, in making you into who you are today. Everything you have, the fame, the money, the adoration, you have because we built it for you. And now you want to dictate terms? I want to be treated like a human being with a mind of her own. The silence that followed was absolute. One of the lawyers, a thin man named Crenshaw, with dead eyes and manicured hands, cleared his throat. Miss Monroe, perhaps you don't fully understand what refusing to sign would mean. You're currently under contract. If you breach that contract, the studio has certain protections. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a fact, delivered with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing an amputation. Marilyn had known this moment was coming. She'd felt it building for months. The slow realization that the machinery of fame that had lifted her up was also designed to grind her down. Every photo shoot where they posed her like a doll. Every interview where they fed her lines about being just a simple girl who got lucky. Every role that required her to be breathless and beautiful and empty. She'd spent years learning to perform gratitude for her own erasure. What protections? She asked, though she already knew. Crenshaw opened a folder and Marilyn's stomach turned to ice. Inside were photographs, taken when she was 18, desperate, 2 weeks away from eviction. The kind of photographs that would destroy the carefully constructed image of innocence the studio had built around her. We would hate for these to become public, Crenshaw said, his voice devoid of emotion. The scandal would be devastating. Your career would be over. Everything you've worked for, gone in a single news cycle. Marilyn looked at the photographs, her younger self, vulnerable and afraid, doing what she had to do to survive. and felt something inside her shift. Not break, harden. So that's what this is, she said softly. I'm not an employee. I'm a prisoner. You're a star, Hartwell corrected, his voice still gentle, still patronizing. And stars shine because we provide the light. Without the studio, you're just another pretty girl from nowhere. Going back to nowhere. He pulled out a fountain pen, expensive and heavy, and set it beside the contract. Sign the contract, Marilyn. Take the money, the fame, the life we've given you. Or refuse and watch everything disappear. It's really that simple. For a long moment, Marilyn stared at the pen. She thought about the apartment she lived in. The studio paid the rent. The car she drove, the studio leased it. The clothes she wore, the parties she attended, the friends who surrounded her, all selected, approved, or provided by the studio. Even her name wasn't really hers. She'd been born Norma Jean, but they'd erased that girl as thoroughly as if she'd never existed. What did she actually own? What part of her life was truly hers? There's a fourth option, Marilyn said quietly. Hartwell raised an eyebrow. And what would that be? I refuse to sign. You release those photographs. You destroy me publicly. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, she wasn't performing. And I tell the truth about all of it. The casting couch auditions, the diet pills you fed me to keep me thin, the sleeping pills to manage my moods, the way you own every actress in this town like cattle, the way you use our bodies to sell tickets and then discard us the moment we show any sign of aging or independence. The air in the room turned electric with threat. No one would believe you, Crenshaw said flatly. A desperate woman with a scandalous past, trying to save her career by inventing lies about the studio that made her famous. You'd be finished before you finished your first sentence. Maybe Marilyn acknowledged, but I'd still have said it. I'd still have told the truth. And that would be mine. The first thing in 6 years that would actually belong to me. She picked up her purse, a small white clutch that matched her dress, and walked toward the door. Her legs felt like water, but she kept them steady through sheer force of will. Marilyn. Hartwell's voice stopped her at the threshold. When she turned, his expression had shifted into something colder, more honest than the paternal mask he usually wore. You walk out that door without signing, and you're declaring war on me, on this studio, on an entire system that's bigger than you, more powerful than you, and absolutely willing to crush you. She thought about all the women who'd come before her, the ones who'd been used up and discarded, the ones who'd tried to fight back and been destroyed, the ones who'd simply disappeared when they stopped being profitable. She thought about the girl she'd been, terrified, powerless, willing to do anything to matter to someone. And she thought about the woman she might become if she walked out that door, unknown, unemployed, possibly ruined, but free. I know, Marilyn said softly, and I'm walking out anyway. She opened the door. Behind her, Hartwell's voice carried one final promise. You'll regret this, Marilyn. I'll make sure of it. She paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and looked back one last time at the 3 men who'd believed they owned her. Maybe, she said, but at least the regret will be mine. And then she was gone, walking down the corridor in her white heels, each step taking her further from everything she'd built and closer to something she couldn't yet name. Freedom, perhaps, or destruction, possibly both. Behind every legend is a truth the world never saw. If this story stirred something in you, type 1. If you're still waiting for the revelation, type 0. Your presence here gives these untold memories a place to breathe. And now, the story continues. The first article appeared 3 days later. Marilyn saw it while having coffee at a diner in Silver Lake, far enough from the studio lot that she thought she could have one morning of anonymity. But the waitress who brought her eggs also brought a folded copy of the morning paper, and there it was, Page 3, below the fold, but impossible to miss. Monroe temperament delays production. The article was brief, carefully worded, sourced to studio insiders who expressed concern about her increasing difficulty on set and emotional instability. It mentioned nothing about the contract negotiations, nothing about her refusal to sign, just a gentle suggestion that Marilyn Monroe, America's sweetheart, was becoming unreliable. She read it twice, her coffee going cold in her hands. This was how it would happen, not a sudden explosion, but a slow erosion. Whispers that would grow into rumors, rumors that would harden into facts. By the time the studio was finished, no one would remember that she'd refused to be owned. They'd only remember that she'd been difficult, unstable, impossible to work with. The waitress returned with the coffee pot. "More coffee, hun?" Marilyn looked up, and the woman's expression shifted. Recognition mixing with something else. Pity, maybe, or judgment. The article was already working. "No, thank you," Marilyn said quietly, leaving money on the table and walking out into the bright Los Angeles morning. Her apartment felt smaller when she returned to it. The studio had called twice, messages left with her answering service. "Mr. Hartwell would like to speak with you. Please call at your earliest convenience." The politeness was a veneer over an order. She didn't call back. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in 6 years. She went to the public library. Not the glamorous celebrity haunts where photographers waited like patient vultures, but the small branch library in Glendale, where no one expected to see a movie star among the card catalogs and dusty reference books. She spent 4 hours reading contracts. Not her contracts, she'd already memorized every clause, every trap buried in the language, but the contracts of other actresses. The library kept copies of public records, and she discovered what she'd suspected. The studio owned everyone. Different terms, different amounts of money, but the same fundamental truth. They were all property. "Can I help you find something?" "Yeah." The librarian was elderly, sharp-eyed, wearing a cardigan despite the warmth. She looked at Marilyn with the clinical interest of someone cataloging an unusual specimen. "I'm looking for precedent," Marilyn said. "Has anyone ever successfully broken a studio contract?" The librarian studied her for a long moment. "You're her, aren't you? The actress." Marilyn waited for the excitement, the request for an autograph, the performance she'd have to give. Instead, the librarian said, "Follow me." She led Marilyn to a back room where older records were kept, boxes of newspapers from the 1930s and early 40s. There was a woman, the librarian said, pulling out a bound volume of yellowed clippings. Frances Farmer tried to fight the studio system. They had her committed to an institution. Marilyn felt her blood run cold. And Olivia de Havilland, the librarian continued, pulling another volume. She sued Warner Brothers in 1943. Took 3 years, but she won, changed the law about how long studios could keep actors under contract. She won? Marilyn's voice was barely a whisper. She won, but it cost her. Years of not working, blacklisted, her career essentially over by the time the verdict came through. She was brave. The librarian looked at Marilyn directly. Or foolish, depending on your perspective. Marilyn spent the rest of the afternoon reading about Olivia de Havilland's case, taking notes in a small notebook she'd bought at the drugstore. The legal battle had been brutal. The studios had unlimited resources, unlimited patience, unlimited willingness to destroy anyone who challenged their power. But de Havilland had won. When Marilyn left the library, it was nearly dark. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, hadn't called anyone back, hadn't performed Being Marilyn Monroe for almost 12 hours. It felt strange, liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Her apartment building was dark when she arrived, but not empty. A man sat in a car across the street. She recognized him as one of the studio's private investigators. They were watching her now, documenting her movements, her contacts, anything they could use. Inside her apartment, the phone was ringing. She let it ring. When it finally stopped, she went to her bedroom and opened the closet. Behind the rows of dresses, all studio approved, all carefully selected to maintain her image, was a small box she'd hidden when she first moved in. Inside were the few things from her life before: photographs of her mother, a cheap necklace her first foster family had given her, and a notebook filled with writings she had never shown anyone. Stories, poems, fragments of thoughts written by Norma Jean before she'd have been erased. She sat on her bed and read them for the first time in years, and it was like hearing the voice of a ghost. A girl who dreamed of being an actress, really an actress, doing Shakespeare and Tennessee Williams, not just wearing dresses and saying lines written to make men feel things. The phone rang again. This time she answered. "Miss Monroe." The voice was unfamiliar, professional, male. "My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney specializing in contract law and entertainment litigation. I've been following your situation with great interest." Marilyn's grip tightened on the receiver. "How did you get this number?" "I have a colleague who works in the public records office. She mentioned a certain actress was researching contract disputes at the library today." He paused. I'd like to help you if you'll allow it." "Why would you want to help me?" "Because I'm tired of watching the studios devour people." His voice was quiet, sincere. "I represented 3 actresses in the past 5 years. 2 settled quietly and went back to work. 1 didn't, and now she's working as a secretary in Burbank. But I learned something from each case. I know how they think, how they operate, where their vulnerabilities are." "And you think I have a chance?" "I think you have a choice," Chen said carefully. "You can fight them and probably lose everything, or you can settle, sign the contract, go back to being what they want you to be. There's no shame in survival, Miss Monroe. But if you want to fight, I can show you how." Marilyn Tishin closed her eyes. Outside of her window, the city sparkled with a million lights, each one a dream, a hope, a person trying to matter in a place that devoured them like fuel. "I want to fight," she said. The second article appeared the next morning. "Monroe refuses studio obligations, production shutdown." This one was more aggressive. It quoted unnamed co-stars expressing frustration with her behavior. It mentioned weight gain, tardiness, forgetting lines. It painted a picture of a woman spiraling out of control, unable to handle the pressures of fame. Marilyn read it in Chen's office, a cramped space above a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, while the attorney reviewed her contract with the methodical attention of a surgeon examining a tumor. "They're building a case," Chen said without looking up. "Not a legal case, a public one. By the time this goes to court, if it goes to court, they'll have half of Los Angeles believing you're unstable. Makes it easier to justify any action they take." "What kind of action?" Chen finally met her eyes. "Commitment to a psychiatric facility. It's been done before. Actress becomes difficult. Studio doctors declare her mentally unfit. Family signs commitment papers. Or the studio finds someone who will. By the time she gets out, her career is over and she's too damaged to fight back." The words settled over Marilyn like a weight. "They can do that?" she whispered. "They can do anything they want if you give them the ammunition." Chen pulled out a document. "That's why we need to move fast. File a lawsuit before they can paint you as incompetent. Show the world you're not having a breakdown. You're standing up for your rights. And if I lose, then you lose." Chen's honesty was brutal but clean. "You'll be blacklisted. You won't work in Hollywood again." "They'll make sure of that. But at least you'll have fought. At least the truth will be on record." Marilyn thought about the girl in the photographs. 18, desperate, doing what she had to do to survive. She thought about 6 years of smiling on command, of being touched and posed and directed like an object. She thought about 7 more years of the same, or worse. "Draw up the papers," she said. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the city breathe, knowing that tomorrow everything would change. Once Chen filed the lawsuit, there would be no going back. The studio would use every weapon they had. The photographs, the manufactured scandals, the carefully orchestrated destruction of everything she'd built. At 3 in the morning, her doorbell rang. Marilyn approached the door carefully, peering through the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, elegant and composed despite the hour. Marilyn recognized her immediately. Catherine Sterling, one of the most powerful agents in Hollywood. She represented directors, producers, people who made decisions rather than followed them. Yes. Marilyn opened the door. "We need to talk," Catherine said, and there was something in her voice, urgency mixed with warning, that made Marilyn step aside and let her in. Catherine walked to the window, looking out at the sleeping city. "The studio called me. They want me to represent you, convince you to sign the contract, smooth us over before it becomes a war. And are you here to convince me?" Catherine turned, and her expression was complicated, respect mixing with concern. "I'm here to tell you what they're planning, because you deserve to know what you're up against." She pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to Marilyn. Inside were more photographs, but not of Marilyn. These were of David Chen, outside a known communist meeting hall, shaking hands with people who'd been blacklisted during the McCarthy hearings. Doctored evidence that would destroy his career and his life if made public. "They're going to discredit your lawyer," Catherine said quietly. "Make him unemployable. And if that doesn't work, they have dirt on everyone you might turn to, every lawyer, every agent, every friend. Nah, they'll isolate you completely." Marilyn's hands shook as she held the photographs. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know exactly what you're choosing." Catherine's voice was steady, unflinching. "This isn't a contract dispute. This is a war against an empire that has been building power for 30 years. They will destroy you, Marilyn, completely, mercilessly, and without hesitation. And the world will watch and do nothing because Hollywood is America's dream factory, and dreams are more valuable than truth." She walked to the door, then paused. "But I'll also tell you this. If you fight them and somehow win, you'll change every maquette for every actress who comes after you, for every person who's ever been owned by someone more powerful." The door closed softly behind her, and Marilyn was alone with the photographs and the crushing weight of her choice. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In 6 hours, David Chen would file the lawsuit, and Marilyn Monroe would discover whether freedom was worth the cost of everything she'd ever known. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Marilyn hadn't expected this. She'd somehow imagined filing the lawsuit would be a quiet, bureaucratic affair. Papers stamped, filed away, a legal process beginning in silence. Instead, there were cameras, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Questions shouted over each other in a cacophony of noise. "Marilyn, is it true you're suing Paramount? Are you having a nervous breakdown? Is that about money, creative control?" David Chen guided her through the crowd with a firm hand on her elbow, but Marilyn could feel the weight of their stares, the flash of bulbs burning the afterimages into her vision. She kept her head down, her sunglasses on, trying to be invisible, an impossible task for someone whose face had been engineered to be seen. Inside the courthouse, the air was cooler, quieter. The marble floors echoed with her footsteps as Chen led her to a clerk's office where the lawsuit would be officially filed. The document was 47 pages long. Chen had worked through the night to compile it, citing breach of contract, unfair labor practices, coercion, and a dozen other legal terms that all boiled down to one simple truth. The studio treated her like property, and she was demanding to be recognized as a person. "Once I file this, there's no going back," Chen said quietly, his hand hovering over the counter. "They'll come at us with everything. You understand that?" Marilyn thought about Catherine Sterling's warning. about the photographs of Chen, about the machinery of destruction already grinding into motion. I understand, she said. Chen handed the papers to the clerk, and just like that, it was done. The war had officially begun. The studio's response came within hours, not through legal channels, that would take days, but through the press. By noon, every newspaper in Los Angeles carried some version of the same story. Marilyn Monroe, unstable and ungrateful, was suing the studio that had made her a star. Quotes from sources close to the production painted her as delusional, paranoid, unable to distinguish between the normal pressures of filmmaking and persecution. And then, carefully buried in the third paragraph of the Hollywood Reporter's coverage, was the photograph. Not the one from when she was 18. They were saving that weapon for when they really needed it. This was something else. A picture of Marilyn leaving a psychiatrist's office 6 months ago, accompanying a story about her ongoing mental health struggles. She'd gone to see Dr. Sarah Feldman because she couldn't sleep, because the pills the studio gave her made her feel disconnected from reality, because she needed someone to talk to who wasn't on the studio payroll. It had been private, confidential, protected by doctor-patient privilege. But somehow the studio had known, and somehow they'd had a photographer waiting. Marilyn sat in Chen's office, staring at the newspaper, and felt the walls closing in. They were always watching us, she said quietly. Every moment, every choice, every attempt at privacy, they were documenting it, building a file in case I ever stepped out of line. Chen's expression was grim. It's standard practice. The studios keep dossiers on all their talent. Insurance, they call it. Insurance, see? Marilyn laughed, but the sound was hollow. That's one word for it. The phone on Chen's desk rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then held it out to her. It's for you. Marilyn took the receiver, her heart hammering. Marilyn. The voice was female, older, carrying the weight of hard-earned authority. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm an actress, or I was before Paramount decided I was too old at 35. Marilyn said nothing, waiting. I read about your lawsuit, Margaret continued, and I want you to know you're not alone. There are dozens of us, actresses who were used up and thrown away, who were blacklisted for asking for basic dignity, who were destroyed for refusing to sleep with executives or accept roles that demeaned us. Why are you calling me? Marilyn asked. Because I want to testify for you. I have documentation, contracts, memos, recordings, evidence of how the studio system operates, and I'm not the only one. If you're willing to fight, we're willing to stand with you. Marilyn's throat tightened. They'll destroy you too. They already destroyed me, Margaret said simply. I haven't worked in 3 years. My career is over. But maybe my testimony can help save yours. And maybe, just maybe, we can crack the foundation of this whole rotten system. When Marilyn hung up, Chen was watching her carefully. She wants to testify, Marilyn said. She has evidence. So do 4 other women who have called this morning. Chen pulled out a notepad covered in names and phone numbers. All blacklisted actresses, all with stories about the studio system. If we can get them on the record, if we can show a pattern of abuse, it becomes bigger than just me, Marilyn finished. It becomes about changing the entire industry. For the first time since walking out of Hartwell's office, Marilyn felt something other than fear. Not hope exactly, that felt too fragile, too dangerous, but a possibility. The sense that she might not be fighting alone after all. The depositions began a week later. Marilyn sat in a sterile conference room while Paramount's lawyers asked her questions designed to make her look unstable, ungrateful, or both. They asked about her childhood, her relationships, her visits to Dr. Feldman. They asked about pills and drinking and whether she'd ever thought about hurting herself. Isn't it true, Miss Monroe, that you have difficulty remembering lines? That you've been late to set repeatedly? That directors have described you as difficult to work with? Each question was a knife, precisely placed to draw blood without leaving obvious wounds. But Marilyn had learned something in 6 years of performing. She knew how to control her face, her voice, her body language. She answered each question calmly, honestly, refusing to be baited into emotional reactions they could use against her. "I've been late to set," she acknowledged, "when the studio scheduled me for 18-hour days without breaks, when they gave me pills to stay awake and pills to sleep and expected me to be perfect on 2 hours of rest. I've had difficulty remembering lines when those lines were written to make me sound stupid, when my entire role consisted of being decoration for the male actors. And yes, I saw a psychiatrist because working in an environment where you're treated as property rather than a person takes a psychological toll." The lawyer, a man named Thornton with silver hair and a smile like a shark, leaned forward. "So you admit you have psychological problems?" "I admit that being owned by someone creates psychological problems," Marilyn said quietly. "But the problem isn't me. It's the system that tried to own me." Thornton made a note, his expression satisfied. Marilyn realized her mistake too late. They'd just gotten her to admit she had psychological problems on the record. By the time that quote made it to the newspapers, the context would be gone. That night, alone in her apartment, Marilyn stood in front of her bathroom mirror. She looked tired, thinner than the studio had kept her through their controlled diets and pills. Her hair needed dyeing. The roots showed dark against the manufactured platinum blonde. Without makeup, without the careful lighting of a film set, she looked human, fragile, breakable. She thought about giving up, about calling Hartwell and begging for forgiveness, about signing the contract and going back to being what they wanted her to be. It would be easier, safer, and part of her, the scared part that remembered being 18 and desperate, wanted nothing more than to surrender. But then she thought about Margaret Hayes, about the 4 other women who'd called to offer testimony, about all the actresses who would come after her, who would face the same choice, be owned or be destroyed. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. "Miss Monroe." The voice was unfamiliar, young, nervous female. "Please don't hang up. My name is Rebecca Simmons. I'm a script supervisor at Paramount. I have something you need to see." "What kind of something?" Marilyn asked cautiously. "Evidence, real evidence. Documents that show the studio's been planning this for months. How they manipulated you, watched you, built their case against you before you even walked into that contract meeting." Marilyn's blood ran cold. "Why would you give this to me? You'll lose your job." "I already quit," Rebecca said. "I've spent 5 years watching them do this to women. I can't be part of it anymore." "Can we meet somewhere private?" They met at 2 in the morning in a diner in Inglewood, far from the studio, far from anywhere Marilyn might be recognized. Rebecca was 26, plain-faced, wearing cat-eye glasses, and carrying a leather satchel that she gripped like a lifeline. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were memos, meeting notes, a timeline that began 8 months ago, long before Marilyn had ever thought about refusing to sign. "They knew you were getting restless," Rebecca said quietly. "One of their psychiatrists, not Dr. Feldman, someone else, flagged you as a potential problem. Said you were showing signs of independent thinking." Marilyn stared at the phrase typed in black ink on official studio letterhead. Independent thinking, like it was a disease. "So they started building a file," Rebecca continued, "documenting every time you were late, every mistake, every moment they could use to paint you as unstable. They had photographers following you, private investigators tracking your movements. They even had someone monitoring your mail. The invasion felt total, suffocating. And this," Rebecca pulled out another document, "is the plan they drew up in case you refused to sign. Step 1, isolate her from allies. Step 2, destroy her credibility. Step 3, force hospitalization if necessary. Step 4, nullify the contract on grounds of mental incompetence and blacklist her from the industry. Marilyn's hands shook as she read the clinical, methodical blueprint for her destruction. They were going to do this anyway, she whispered, whether I fought back or not. They'd already decided I was too much trouble. Yes, Rebecca said, but now you have proof that this wasn't about you being difficult. It was about them maintaining absolute control, proof that they systematically target any woman who shows independence. Marilyn looked up from the documents, meeting Rebecca's eyes. Why are you risking everything to give me this? Rebecca was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but sad. Because I have a little sister. She's 16, beautiful, wants to be an actress. And I won't let her walk into the system thinking it's going to make her dreams come true. Someone has to break it, and you're the only one brave enough to try. Marilyn gathered the documents carefully, reverently, knowing they represented both a weapon and a target on her back. Thank you, she said. Rebecca stood to leave, then paused. Miss Monroe, they're going to come at you with every face now. The photographs, the scandals, things you can't even imagine. But remember, they're only desperate because you're winning. People who have real power don't need to destroy their enemies. They only destroy threats. She walked out into the night, leaving Marilyn alone in the fluorescent diner with evidence that could change everything. Or get her killed, because she had just learned the most dangerous truth of all. The studio hadn't been reacting to her rebellion. They'd been planning her destruction long before she ever found the courage to fight back. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late September. Not a full trial that would take months to arrange, but a preliminary hearing where both sides would present their basic arguments and the judge would decide whether Marilyn's lawsuit had merit enough to proceed. Chen had warned her this was where the studio would go for the kill. They'd parade witnesses, present evidence of her instability, argue that the lawsuit itself was proof of her deteriorating mental state. If they could get the case dismissed here, they'd never have to face a real trial. Marilyn arrived at the courthouse at 8:30, an hour before the hearing was set to begin. She wore a simple navy suit, professional, understated, chosen specifically to counter the image of her as frivolous and sexual. Her hair was pulled back in a modest bun. No dramatic makeup, no platinum glamour. She needed to look like a serious person fighting for serious rights, not a movie star throwing a tantrum. But the courthouse steps told a different story. Photographers lined both sides, 3D cameras ready, and among them were protesters, women holding signs that read "Ungrateful" and "Hollywood Jezebel." The studio had mobilized fan clubs, paying them to show up and demonstrate against her, making it look like public sentiment had turned. Chen gripped her arm. Don't react. Don't give them anything they can use. Marilyn walked through the gauntlet with her head high, ignoring the shouts, the camera flashes, the signs calling her a traitor to the very industry that had made her a star. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. She recognized faces from the studio, executives, publicists, the entire machinery of control assembled to watch her be dismantled. And sitting in the front row, impeccably dressed and utterly composed, was Victor Hartwell. He smiled at her, not cruel, almost gentle. The smile of someone who knew exactly how this would end and felt no need to gloat about it. The judge entered, a man named Harrison Blackwell, 63, with a reputation for being fair, but also for being deeply respectful of established institutions. Not ideal, but not hopeless. The studio's attorney, Thornton, began his opening statement. It was a masterpiece of character assassination disguised as concern. He painted Marilyn as a troubled woman who'd been given everything, fame, wealth, opportunity, and had responded with paranoia and ingratitude. He cited her visits to Dr. Feldman as evidence of mental instability. He presented testimony from directors about her lateness and difficulty on set, and then he played his trump card. Your Honor, we have evidence that Miss Monroe has been associating with known communist sympathizers. including her attorney, Mr. David Chen, who has documented ties to organizations currently under investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee. The courtroom erupted. Chen stood, his face pale but controlled. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to, Mr. Chen, sit down. Judge Blackwell's voice was sharp. Mr. Thornton, I assume you have evidence for the serious allegation? Thornton smiled and produced the photographs Catherine Sterling had warned Marilyn about. Chen, outside the meeting hall, shaking hands with blacklisted writers, attending a rally for workers' rights that the studio had labeled communist propaganda. We believe, Thornton continued smoothly, that Miss Monroe's lawsuit is not actually about contract disputes, but part of a larger pattern of communist infiltration into Hollywood, that she's being manipulated by subversive elements seeking to undermine us from American industry. It was brilliant, vicious and brilliant. In one move, they turned a labor dispute into a question of national loyalty. And in 1954, with McCarthy's shadow still looming over Hollywood, even the suggestion of communist ties was enough to destroy careers. Marilyn watched Chen's face as he absorbed the blow. This was what they threatened: professional annihilation. Not just for her, but for anyone who dared help her. Judge Blackwell looked at Chen with something between suspicion and disappointment. Mr. Chen, I think we need to address these allegations before we proceed with... Your Honor. Marilyn stood, her voice cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. Everyone turned to look at her. Oh, that's her. Miss Monroe, the judge said, surprised. You need to let your attorney speak for you. My attorney is being smeared to discredit me, Marilyn said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. And I won't let that happen without responding. Miss Monroe, this is highly irregular. So is a studio systematically destroying someone's life because she asked to be treated like a human being. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Marilyn reached into her bag and pulled out the folder Rebecca had given her. Her hand shook slightly, but she kept her voice level. Your Honor, I have documents, internal studio memos showing that Paramount planned to destroy my career 8 months ago, long before this lawsuit, long before I refused to sign their contract. They targeted me not because I'm unstable, but because I showed what they call independent thinking. She walked forward and handed the folder to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Those documents show a systematic campaign to isolate me, discredit me, and if necessary, have me committed to a psychiatric facility against my will. They show that the studio maintains files on all their talent, documenting anything that could be used for blackmail or coercion. And they show that what's happening to me has happened to dozens of other actresses who dared to question the system. Judge Blackwell opened the folder, his expression unreadable, as he scanned the first few pages. The courtroom held its breath. Thornton stood quickly. Your Honor, we have no way of verifying the authenticity of those documents. They could have been forged, fabricated by Miss Monroe and her communist-sympathizing attorney. They're real. The voice came from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. Rebecca Simmons stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 other women Marilyn didn't recognize. My name is Rebecca Simmons. I was the script supervisor at Paramount for 5 years. I provided those documents to Miss Monroe, and I'm prepared to testify under oath to their authenticity. As am I. One of the other women stepped forward. She was older, elegant, with the bearing of someone who'd once been powerful. I'm Catherine Sterling. I'm an agent, and I've seen the studio's files on dozens of actresses. What Miss Monroe is describing is standard practice across all the major studios. Hartwell's composure finally cracked. He stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is absurd. These women are clearly coordinating their stories. Are you? Judge Blackwell asked, looking at Rebecca. No, Your Honor. I quit my job last week because I couldn't be complicit in this anymore. I didn't know Miss Sterling was going to be here. But I'm not surprised, because what Paramount is doing isn't unique. It's how the entire system operates. The judge looked at Marilyn, then at the documents, then at Hartwell, whose face had gone red with barely suppressed fury. Your Honor, Marilyn said quietly, I'm not a communist. I'm not unstable. I'm not ungrateful. I'm simply an actress who asked for the basic human right to have a say in her own career. And the studio's response was to try to destroy me. She turned to face Hartwell directly. For the first time in 6 years, she wasn't performing, wasn't calculating her effect. She was just speaking truth. You told me I was nothing without the studio, that you made me and you could unmake me just as easily. And maybe that's true. Maybe you'll succeed in destroying my career, blacklisting me, making sure you will so I never work again, but I won't be silent about it. I won't disappear quietly so the next girl who walks into your office doesn't know what she's signing away. Hartwell's eyes were cold with rage. You're making a mistake, Marilyn. The biggest mistake of your life. No, Marilyn said softly. The biggest mistake of my life was believing that being owned was the same as being loved. The courtroom erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions, the studio's lawyers conferring frantically, the bailiff calling for order. But through it all, Marilyn stood still, feeling something inside her finally, impossibly break free. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel repeatedly. When silence finally fell, his expression was grave. I'm going to recess this hearing for 2 weeks while I review these documents and determine their authenticity. Mr. Thornton, your attempt to inject communist allegations into what appears to be a straightforward labor dispute is noted and not appreciated. We will reconvene on October 14th, at which time I expect both parties to focus on the actual merits of the case. He stood and the courtroom rose with him. As soon as he left, Hartwell crossed the room to where Marilyn stood with Chen. His voice was low, meant only for them to hear, but vibrating with barely controlled fury. You think you have won something here? You haven't. Those documents will be discredited. Those women will be destroyed. And you'll never work in this town again. I'll make sure every studio, every producer, every director knows exactly what kind of ungrateful, manipulative Victor, the voice belonged to Catherine Sterling, who'd materialized beside them. I think you should stop talking, because I've spent the last hour on the phone with reporters from the Times, the Herald, and the Tribune, and I've told them everything about the files, the surveillance, the systematic destruction of women who show independence. By tomorrow morning, this won't be about one actress suing one studio. It'll be about an entire industry on trial. Hartwell's face went white. You wouldn't. I already did. Catherine's smile was cold. You see, Victor, you taught me something very valuable during the 30 years I've worked in this business. Power isn't just about what you can destroy. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to tell the truth. And I'm done sacrificing women to protect men like you. For a long moment, Hartwell stared at her, at Marilyn, at the wreckage of his carefully planned destruction. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. Chen let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for hours. What just happened? Revolution, Catherine said quietly, or the beginning of one anyway. Marilyn walked to the courtroom windows overlooking the street. Outside, the protesters were still there with their signs. The photographers still waited with their cameras. The machinery of her destruction was still in motion, but something had shifted. She'd spoken her truth in a room full of people who'd wanted her to stay silent. She'd presented evidence of a system built on control and coercion. And instead of being dismissed or destroyed, she'd been heard. For the first time in her life, she'd been truly heard. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Chen joined her at the window. Now it gets ugly. Hartwell will fight back with everything he has. The studio will launch a full-scale assault on our credibility. But we've got something we didn't have before. Public attention. And sometimes that's all you need to force change. Huh. Outside, a woman in the crowd lowered her ungrateful sign, looking uncertain. Another one walked away entirely, leaving her sign on the courthouse steps. The tide was turning, slowly, tentatively, but turning nonetheless. Marilyn pressed her palm against the cool glass and watched the city she'd given everything to, the industry that had tried to devour her, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not quite yet, but possibility. The possibility that speaking truth to power might actually matter, that fighting back might actually change something, that she might actually survive this. The headlines came like a tsunami. Studio system exposed. Documents reveal systematic control of actresses. Marilyn Monroe fights back, the truth behind Hollywood's golden cage. Paramount faces crisis as internal memos leaked to press file. Catherine Sterling had kept her word. By Friday morning, every major newspaper in Los Angeles and several national papers ran versions of the same story. Not the studio's carefully crafted narrative about an unstable actress, but the truth about an industry built on ownership disguised as opportunity. Marilyn read the articles in Chen's office, her coffee untouched and going cold. The words should have felt like vindication. Instead, they felt like standing naked in front of the world, every private pain exposed for public consumption. The phone hasn't stopped ringing, Chen said, sorting through messages. 3 more actresses want to testify. 2 columnists want interviews. Someone from the New York Times wants to do a full investigative piece on the studio system. In the studio? Marilyn asked quietly. Chen's expression darkened. Radio silence, which is more terrifying than if they were actively attacking. They're planning something. He was right. The counterattack came not through the press, but through something far more insidious: economic warfare. By Monday, every business that had ever paid Marilyn for an endorsement received a letter from Paramount's legal department, citing morality clauses and suggesting that continued association with Miss Monroe might damage their brand reputation. Within 48 hours, Marilyn lost 3 endorsement deals. Her face was pulled from advertisements for perfume, cosmetics, and a line of women's accessories. The income she'd counted on, the money that wasn't controlled by the studio, evaporated. Then came the personal attacks. Someone leaked her address to the press. Photographers camped outside her apartment building at all hours. Reporters knocked on her neighbors' doors, asking questions about her lifestyle, her visitors, whether she seemed stable. Her landlord, pressured by the constant disruption, gave her 30 days' notice to vacate, and the photographs finally surfaced. Not in the mainstream press. Even Hartwell wasn't bold enough to go that route directly, but in a scandal sheet, one of the cheap tabloids that lived on the edges of respectability. The images from when she was 18, desperate, doing what she had to do to survive. Grainy, explicit, accompanied by text that painted her as a woman of loose morals who'd slept her way to stardom. Marilyn saw them at a newsstand and felt something inside her die. Not shame, she'd made peace with those choices long ago, but what grief for the girl she'd been, whose most vulnerable moment was now being weaponized to destroy the woman she'd become. She bought every copy the newsstand had, 37 in total, and burned them in her apartment's fireplace one by one, watching the images curl and blacken until they were ash. But of course, copies existed elsewhere. By the end of the week, everyone in Hollywood had seen them. The whispers followed her everywhere, in grocery stores, in the few restaurants that would still serve her, in the lobbies of buildings where she had meetings with lawyers and publicists trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Margaret Hayes called one night, her voice heavy with shared grief. "I'm so sorry. I warned you they'd use everything, but I didn't think." "It's not your fault," Marilyn said, staring out her window at the photographers still camped below. "This is who they are. This is what they do to women who refuse to disappear quietly. Are you going to be okay?" Marilyn didn't answer because she didn't know. The depositions from other actresses began appearing in the press. Testimonies from women who'd been blacklisted, coerced, manipulated. Stories that echoed Marilyn's own. The systematic control, the files kept on everyone, the casual cruelty of an industry that viewed human beings as assets to be exploited and discarded. Public opinion began to shift. Slowly at first, then gathering momentum. Women's groups organized protests outside Paramount's offices. A coalition of labor unions issued a statement supporting Marilyn's right to fair contract negotiations. Even some male actors, the ones secure enough in their careers to risk speaking out, gave interviews questioning the studio system's practices. But the victory felt hollow when Marilyn sat alone in her apartment at night, listening to the sounds of photographers outside, knowing that even if she won legally, she might lose everything else. Dr. Feldman called and offered to see her for free, off the books, knowing Marilyn couldn't afford therapy now that her income had dried up. They met in Dr. Feldman's home office, late at night when no one would see. "You look exhausted," Dr. Feldman said gently. Marilyn laughed, the sound brittle. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see those photographs, or I imagine what tomorrow's headline will be, or I wonder if I've destroyed my entire life for nothing." "Do you think it was for nothing?" Marilyn was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, indifferent to her pain. "I think I traded being owned for being destroyed," she said finally. "Before, I was trapped but protected. Now I'm free but completely exposed. I don't know which is worse." Dr. Feldman leaned forward. "You're in the hardest part now, the space between ending one life and beginning another. It feels like death because something is dying, the version of yourself that survived by compliance. But something else is being born too, the version that survives through truth. And if the truth kills me, then at least you'll die as yourself, not as something they created." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a confirmation of her worst fears. 3 weeks after the hearing, Chen called with news. The judge authenticated the documents. Rebecca's testimony held up, and 2 other former Paramount employees came forward to corroborate everything. The case is going to trial. "We won?" Marilyn's voice was hollow. "We survived the first battle," Chen corrected. "The war is just beginning." "But Marilyn, this is huge. The judge didn't dismiss the case. He's taking it seriously. We have a real chance." Marilyn hung up and sat in silence, trying to feel victorious. But all she felt was tired. Bone-deep, soul-crushing, tired. That night, she did something she hadn't done it in years. She went to a small church in Glendale, far from the Hollywood spotlight, and sat in the back pew while evening mass concluded. When the other parishioners left, she remained, staring at the stained glass windows, catching the last of the daylight. A priest approached, elderly, kind-faced, with a gentle manner of someone who had heard countless confessions. "Can I help you, my child?" Marilyn looked up at him and for a moment considered telling him everything. The studio, the photographs, the lawsuit, the crushing weight of fighting a system designed to destroy anyone who challenged it. Instead, she asked, "How do you know if you're doing a right thing when it costs you everything?" The priest sat down beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. "The right thing rarely costs nothing. If it did, everyone would do it. The question isn't whether it was, it's whether you can live with yourself if you don't pay the price." He stood, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Whatever you're fighting for, I hope you find the strength to see it through. And I hope you remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear." When Marilyn finally left the church, night had fully fallen. The photographers had given up and gone home, leaving the street quiet and empty. For the first time in weeks, she could walk without being watched, without being documented, without being turned into content for tomorrow's scandal sheets. She walked for hours through neighborhoods where no one knew her face, where she was just another woman moving through the darkness. And slowly, gradually, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope. She'd learned that hope was too fragile for what she was facing, but determination. The grim, unshakable knowledge that she'd come too far to turn back now. That even if the studio destroyed her completely, even if she never worked again, even if she lost everything, at least she'd have fought. At least she'd have spoken the truth. At least she'd have lived as herself, not as their creation. When she finally returned to her apartment building, there was an envelope wedged in her door. No stamp, no return address, hand-delivered while she was gone. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words written in elegant script. Keep fighting, and beneath it a list of 15 names. Women she didn't know, women who'd left the industry or been pushed out, women who wanted to testify about their own experiences with the studio system. Marilyn held the list against her chest and felt tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally break free. She was alone, but she wasn't alone. And that, for now, was enough. The trial lasted 6 weeks. It became a spectacle unlike anything Hollywood had seen. Not because of the glamour, but because of the rawness. Day after day, women took the stand and told stories that had been buried for decades. Stories of coercion, manipulation, systematic control. Stories of careers destroyed and lives derailed because they dared to say no. Marilyn sat at the defense table through it all, watching other women speak the truths she'd carried alone for so long. And with each testimony, she felt the weight she'd been carrying grow lighter. Not because her pain diminished, but because it was finally impossibly shared. The studio fought viciously. They brought in psychiatrists to question the witnesses' mental stability. They produced contracts and argued that everything had been legal, consensual, standard industry practice. They painted the plaintiffs as bitter, ungrateful women attacking the very system that had given them opportunities. But something had changed in the 6 weeks between the preliminary hearing and the trial. The public had seen too much. The documents Rebecca leaked had revealed too many ugly truths, and the sheer number of women coming forward made it impossible to dismiss them all as hysterical or vindictive. On a cold morning in November, Judge Blackwell delivered his verdict. He ruled that while Paramount's contract wasn't technically illegal, its enforcement had been unconscionable. That the studio's systematic surveillance, coercion, and threats constituted a violation of basic labor rights. That Marilyn Monroe was free from her contract, and that the studio owed her damages for the harm they had inflicted in trying to force compliance. It wasn't a complete victory. The studio system itself remained intact. Other actresses were still bound by similar contracts. The fundamental power dynamics of Hollywood hadn't magically transformed, but it was a crack in the foundation, a precedent that would make it harder for studios to wield absolute control, a public acknowledgement that what had been done to Marilyn and to countless other women was wrong. Marilyn walked out of the courthouse into a crowd of reporters and cameras. But this time the questions were different. How does it feel to win? What will you do next? Do you think this changes Hollywood? She stood on the courthouse steps, the same steps where protesters had held signs calling her ungrateful, and spoke the truth one more time. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about dignity. It's about the right to be treated as a human being, not as property. And I pray that every woman that comes off for me knows she doesn't have to choose between her dreams and her humanity. That she can be an actress, an artist, a star without signing away her soul. She paused, looking out at the crowd, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. As for what I'll do next, I don't know, maybe I'll never make another movie. Maybe Hollywood will keep me blacklisted forever, but I'll still be me. And that's worth more than any contract, any role, any amount of fame. The questions continued, but Marilyn simply smiled and walked away. 2 years later, Marilyn Monroe sat in a small theater in Greenwich Village, watching an off-Broadway production of Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire. She dyed her hair back to its natural brown. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater, no makeup beyond a touch of lipstick. No one in the theater recognized her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. After the trial, the blacklist had been real and total. No major studio would touch her. Agents stopped returning her calls. The roles she'd dreamed of playing, the serious, dramatic parts that would prove she was more than just a pretty face, never materialized. But she'd found other ways to be an actress. Small theater companies in New York. Experimental films made on shoestring budgets by directors who cared about art more than profit. Teaching classes at an acting studio in the village, helping young performers learn their craft without sacrificing their souls. It wasn't the stardom she'd once imagined. She'd never be on magazine covers again, never walk red carpets or have fans screaming her name. But she was acting, really acting. Playing complex characters, speaking beautiful words, doing the work she'd always dreamed of doing. And she was free. After the show, she walked through Washington Square Park as dusk settled over the city. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of roasting chestnuts and the sounds of street musicians playing for spare change. Her phone, a simple flip phone, nothing like the constantly ringing line she'd had in Hollywood, buzzed with a text from Chen. He'd moved to New York too, started a practice representing artists and performers, using everything he'd learned from her case to protect others, just settled another exploitative contract case. Fourth one this year. Your lawsuit set precedent. Change is slow, but it's happening. Marilyn smiled and texted back, "Good. Make sure they know they don't have to fight alone." She stopped at a small cafe where she'd become a regular, the kind of place where the staff knew her as Norma, a theater teacher who always ordered black coffee and wrote in a worn notebook during the quiet afternoon hours. Today, a young woman approached her table hesitantly. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Norma Mortensen, the acting teacher?" Marilyn looked up surprised, or so. "Yes, I am. I saw you in that production of The Glass Menagerie last month. You were incredible." The woman paused, gathering courage. "I'm an actress too, or trying to be, and I just wanted to say the way you taught that workshop last week about finding truth in performance, about not letting anyone make you smaller than you are, it really meant something to me." The woman was young, maybe 22, with stars in her eyes and dreams she probably couldn't articulate yet. Marilyn saw herself in that face, the hunger to matter, to create, to be seen. "What's your name?" Marilyn asked gently. "Sarah." "Well, Sarah, can I tell you something important?" Marilyn gestured to the empty chair across from her, and the young woman sat down. "Whatever path you choose in this industry, remember that your worth isn't determined by how famous you become or how many people know your name. It's determined by whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back." Sarah nodded, absorbing the words with the seriousness they deserved. "And one more thing," Marilyn continued, "if anyone ever tries to make you choose between your dreams and your dignity, choose dignity. Every time. Because dreams that require you to disappear aren't dreams worth having." After Sarah left, Marilyn returned to her notebook, writing thoughts for tomorrow's acting class. Through the cafe window, she watched New York move past in its endless rhythm. Millions of people pursuing their own versions of meaning, most of them unknown and unremembered, but no less valuable for their anonymity. She thought about the girl she'd been, signing that first studio contract with shaking hands and desperate hope. She thought about Marilyn Monroe, the creation that had nearly consumed her. And she thought about who she'd become in the aftermath. Not famous, not wealthy, but authentically herself. The studio had tried to own her. She'd said no, And it had cost her everything the world told her mattered. But in losing everything, she'd found in the only thing that actually did, the freedom to be real. Somewhere in Los Angeles, young actresses were still signing contracts that would shape and control their lives. Somewhere in Hollywood, the machinery of fame was still grinding, still building and destroying in equal measure. But because Monroe had fought back, because she'd spoken truth to power and survived, those young actresses had a choice she hadn't been given. They had precedent. They had proof that the system could be challenged. They had hope. And as the sun set over New York, casting long shadows through the cafe window, Norma Jean Mortensen, once Marilyn Monroe, once America's most famous dream, smiled at her reflection in the window glass. She recognized herself. And that finally was enough. Because fame may shape the world's memory of a person, but only truth shapes their soul. Some stories never truly end. They simply fade into the quiet corners of memory. If today's journey awakens something in you, share your thoughts below. And remember, every untold story deserves someone willing to listen. What do you believe matters more? How a legend lived, or how they were remembered? If this story moved you, please subscribe to Marilyn Monroe, The Untold Legacy, so that more forgotten voices from Hollywood's past can be heard again.